Picture this. Moscow, the capital of Russia, the city that has always been seen as untouchable, is now facing a reality it hasn't experienced in generations. Direct consequences of war landing at its doorstep. While President Putin hides away in a bunker, ordinary people above ground are left to deal with the fear and chaos caused by incoming drone strikes. But here's the thing. This fear didn't suddenly appear with one attack, and it won't vanish after one is over. What's happening now is much bigger than a single explosion. This is about Moscow, the beating heart of Russia, beginning to feel the strain of a war that its own leaders started. And it's not just about sirens and drones. It's about everyday life grinding to a halt as vital resources run thin. Take fuel, for example. Recent footage shows endless lines of cars stretching outside gas stations. Drivers aren't just waiting, they're desperate. Why? Because Ukrainian drone strikes have disrupted supplies, leaving even Russia's largest cities scrambling for fuel. And this isn't happening out in some far-off province. These shortages are unfolding along the highway connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow, two of the country's most important hubs, and the very cities that Putin and the Russian elite prioritize above all others. Now, those elites can no longer pretend that the war is some distant conflict fought only on Ukrainian soil. They're beginning to feel it in their commutes, in their travel plans, and in their basic quality of life. The pressure doesn't stop there. International sanctions are biting deeper, forcing the Kremlin into uncomfortable situations. Just this week, Russian officials submitted a request to the International Civil Aviation Organization, begging for relief. They warned that sanctions are making it nearly impossible to keep their planes flying safely. Why? Because Russia, despite its global ambitions, still depends heavily on Western aircraft, Boeing and Airbus jets in particular. Without spare parts, much of their fleet risks being grounded. And here's where it gets surreal. Russia is trying to shift the blame. Officials claim that if passenger planes start crashing, it won't be their fault. It will be the fault of the United Nations for enforcing sanctions. In other words, they're trying to guilt-trip the world into lifting restrictions by suggesting that ordinary Russian lives are at risk, while conveniently ignoring who launched this war in the first place. The irony is hard to miss. Sanctions are working, but only partially because loopholes still exist. Western-made components are still sneaking their way into Russian military equipment, including drones. That means enforcement isn't nearly as strong as it needs to be. And while Russia pleads for sympathy, Ukrainian civilians continue to face missile strikes, bombings, and devastation every single day. For many, the idea of worrying about whether Aeroflot can keep its vacation flights going feels almost absurd compared to the suffering inside Ukraine. If Russia truly cared about keeping its airlines running safely, it could prioritize maintenance instead of pouring resources into building rockets to bombard Ukrainian cities. But that choice alone shows where the government's priorities really are. And this is exactly what I mean when I say the siege of Moscow has already begun. Think back to how sieges worked in history. Armies would surround a city, cut off food and supplies, and wait until the people inside either starved or surrendered. That's essentially what's happening to Moscow today, but without an army ever physically marching around its walls. Instead, Ukraine is pulling off a 21st century version of a siege. Using drones, it's striking at the lifelines that keep Russia's biggest cities functioning. Railway hubs, oil depots, refineries, storage warehouses. Add sanctions on top of that, and suddenly it's not so easy for Russia to just carry on with business as usual. And then came last night's drone attack. A perfect example of how this strategy hits not just the military, but also the civilian population. For the first time in decades, Muscovites are hearing their mayor warn them that their city is under assault. Reports said about 10 explosions were heard echoing across Moscow. Airports immediately shut down. Flights were delayed, diverted, or canceled. The entire sky above the capital was closed off. Imagine you're on a plane already descending toward Moscow when this happens. You can't land. That's exactly what occurred. One passenger jet had to circle in the air, trapped above the city but unable to touch down. Witness videos show that same plane flying at an unusually low altitude, barely above the rooftops, about the height of a 10-story building, maybe 12 at most. For passengers inside, that must have been terrifying. And for residents watching from the ground, it was a jarring reminder that the war they were told was happening far away is now hovering right over their heads. I dug into why this situation unfolded the way it did, and here's what I found. Despite Putin's constant talk of Russia being a global military superpower, their air defense systems aren't nearly as advanced as he claims. Their radars are weak, and their track record proves it. More than once, Russian forces have mistakenly shot down civilian aircraft because they couldn't properly identify what was flying overhead. So, when Ukraine's drones enter the skies near Moscow, the authorities' go-to move is to shut everything down, even if that leaves civilian planes circling dangerously low over the city. The Russian military has a history of making catastrophic mistakes in the skies. You might remember last Christmas, when their forces shot down an Azerbaijani plane. People in Azerbaijan haven't forgotten that, and the anger is still raw today. That's why, during this latest incident in Moscow, reports suggest air traffic controllers gave an unusual order. Civilian planes were told to stay below drone flight levels. In other words, the jet we saw flying low over the city wasn't malfunctioning. It was intentionally kept under the altitude where drones were buzzing, all to reduce the chance of being misidentified and blown out of the sky. Imagine that. Passengers sitting in their seats had to circle above the capital at the height of an office tower, not because of weather, not because of technical problems, but because their own military can't tell the difference between a drone and a passenger jet. That speaks volumes about the limits of Russia's air defense system. And speaking of drones, let's talk about what actually happened during that strike. Clips from social media show Ukrainian drones streaking through the night sky as they zeroed in on targets inside Moscow. For residents, the sight was surreal. Machines humming overhead, explosions echoing across the city, and the unmistakable realization that the war had reached their streets. The atmosphere turned to panic. News headlines spoke of drones swarming Moscow, and the fear was visible in the shaky phone videos locals uploaded online. Families rushed to shelters, traffic snarled, and rumors spread faster than facts. The Kremlin responded in a way that tells you just how shaken it was. Almost immediately, new censorship measures were rolled out. Reports of the attack were limited, certain clips were scrubbed from Russian websites, and the state media narrative tried to shift attention elsewhere. It's a pattern we've seen again and again. The deeper Ukrainian strikes reach into Russia, the tighter Moscow clamps down on what its citizens are allowed to see or hear. And yet, despite the censorship, cracks are showing. Even within Russia, there are journalists and citizens who continue to ask hard questions about the war and its costs. Doing that under a government as repressive as Putin's is no small feat. Every year, there are voices, some small, some surprisingly bold, that push back, demanding answers about a conflict that no longer feels far away. These people aren't outside critics shouting from the safety of another country. They're living under Putin's rule, risking real consequences and still speaking up. One Russian journalist, known for asking uncomfortable questions at Putin's staged press conferences, recently confronted him head-on. The question was simple but devastating. Mr. President, Russia is no longer safe. Because of the war you started, and because the war isn't going well, how do you feel about that? It didn't stop there. The journalist pointed to the BRICS summit, where Russia had signed a declaration full of lofty promises, commitments to global stability, fairness, and security. He reminded Putin that Russia even made those words the motto of its BRICS presidency. Then he asked the obvious follow-up. How do those values match the reality of your actions? Where is the fairness, stability, or security in your invasion of Ukraine? The questions hit at the core of Russia's crumbling image. Before February 2022, the journalist noted, there were no drone strikes in Russian cities, no cross-border shelling, no foreign troops stepping foot on Russian territory. All of this chaos arrived only after Putin launched what he calls his special military operation. And then came the kicker. British intelligence recently warned that Russia is trying to export this same chaos abroad by carrying out sabotage, arson, and covert attacks on European soil. Where's the stability in that? The journalist asked. Where's the security, even for Russians themselves? Putin's response followed a familiar script. Instead of addressing the journalist's points, he reframed the issue as an existential struggle for Russia's sovereignty. Yes, he admitted, drone strikes didn't happen before the war, but he claimed the situation back then was worse. According to him, Western countries had long been conspiring to keep Russia in its place, a second-class nation, good only for supplying oil, gas, and raw materials. In his telling, that would have meant the eventual collapse of Russian independence. So, by his logic, invading Ukraine wasn't an act of aggression, it was an act of survival. Without the war, he insists, Russia could not exist. Putin doubled down in his response, repeating a familiar theme. Without sovereignty, Russia cannot survive. He framed the war as a necessary step to strengthen that sovereignty, not just militarily, but in economics, finance, and politics as well. In his words, this was about transforming Russia into a fully independent, self-sufficient state, one that could stand tall alongside partners like those in BRICS, whom he claimed respect Russia's traditions and independence. Then he shifted gears to NATO, a talking point he almost never leaves out. From Putin's perspective, the real betrayal didn't start in Ukraine in 2022. It began years earlier when NATO expanded eastward. He argued that Moscow repeatedly begged Western countries not to move military infrastructure closer to Russia's borders, and that those requests were ignored. Worse, he claimed, Western leaders had promised, to our faces, as he put it, that NATO would not expand, only to break their word later. He painted Ukraine as the ultimate example of this unfairness. According to him, NATO wasn't just flirting with the idea of moving in. It was already building bases practically in Russia's underbelly. He tied this directly to the 2014 Maidan Revolution, describing it not as a grassroots uprising but as a Western-funded coup that violated international law and the UN Charter. In his telling, this outside interference pushed Ukraine, and, by extension, Russia, toward open conflict. From there, he piled on more grievances, violations of OSCE agreements, broken security guarantees, and what he described as the West's one-sided approach to global stability. His refrain was the same. Is this fair? Is this security? For Putin, the conclusion is already decided. Russia, in his view, has no choice but to change this situation, because NATO's growth and Western actions left Moscow with no other path. To many outside observers, Putin's response wasn't new. It was the same script he's used for years. Western analysts point out that every time he talks about NATO expansion or broken promises, he's recycling arguments that date back to the early 1990s. The problem is, no official treaty ever guaranteed NATO would stop expanding. What existed were informal discussions and vague assurances, which Moscow now portrays as binding commitments. By repeating this story over and over, Putin reframes Russia not as the aggressor, but as a victim forced into action.
If you've made it this far into the video, it means you're enjoying what we do here at Euro Bulletin. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more updates and insights from Europe and its partners. Let's dive in more into the subject.
Inside Russia, though, the effect is different. State media amplifies these talking points relentlessly, presenting NATO as a hostile alliance bent on dismantling the country. For Russians who rely only on Kremlin-controlled television, the narrative feels convincing. NATO surrounded them, the West lied, and Putin is defending the homeland. It's propaganda 101. Hammer the same message until it feels like truth. But not everyone in Russia buys it. Independent journalists and ordinary citizens, especially those who travel, use VPNs, or follow outside news, see the contradictions. They know NATO bases aren't scattered across Ukraine. They remember that before 2014, Russia itself signed agreements recognizing Ukraine's independence and borders. And they see how the war, justified in the name of security, has instead made Russia less safe. Drones striking Moscow, airports closing, sanctions cutting deep, and soldiers coming home in coffins. Abroad, Putin's answer is read as both strategic and desperate. Strategic, because it keeps the spotlight on NATO rather than Russia's own invasion. Desperate, because the longer the war drags on, the less convincing these arguments sound to anyone outside his bubble. Western officials often note how his speeches recycle the same grievances while sidestepping the basic reality. Russia chose to invade a sovereign neighbor. Even BRICS, his supposed circle of respectful partners, isn't united behind his narrative. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa may avoid openly condemning him, but they aren't rushing to embrace his version of events either. For them, Putin's insistence that NATO expansion justified a full-scale invasion sounds less like a defense of sovereignty and more like a geopolitical excuse. And that's the deeper irony. While Putin claims the war was necessary to secure Russia's independence, it has left Russia more isolated, dependent, and vulnerable than at any time since the fall of the Soviet Union. Here's where Putin's carefully polished story collides with the daily reality on the ground. He stands on stages, talking about NATO threats and the need to protect Russia's sovereignty. But for people living in Moscow or St. Petersburg, sovereignty doesn't feel like an abstract concept. It feels like empty gas tanks, canceled flights, and the sudden roar of air defense systems firing above their heads at night. Take the fuel shortages. A siege in medieval times meant cutting off food supplies to starve out a city. In modern Russia, it means drivers waiting hours in endless lines at gas stations, watching prices climb, and realizing that Ukraine's drones aren't just hitting military depots, they're squeezing the daily life of millions. It's not some distant battlefield anymore. It's the family car running on fumes. Or look at aviation. Putin talks about independence and sovereignty, yet his country still relies on Boeing and Airbus spare parts to keep planes in the sky. Sanctions have slammed the doors shut, forcing airlines to cannibalize old jets just to keep a fraction of the fleet running. That's why, during the recent drone attack, one unlucky passenger plane circled Moscow so low it looked like it might scrape rooftops. It wasn't bravery or skill. It was pure improvisation in a system that's cracking under pressure. Then there are the drones themselves. Every time one buzzes over Moscow, it shatters the illusion that the war is contained somewhere over there in Ukraine. Sirens blare, airports shut down, flights divert, and Muscovites huddle in basements. Social media fills with shaky clips, glowing objects streaking across the night sky, sudden fireballs on the horizon. And no matter how tightly the Kremlin censors the news, those images slip through, spreading on Telegram channels and private chats faster than censors can delete them. That's the true siege of Moscow. Not soldiers outside the gates, but fear, shortages, and constant reminders that the empire is bleeding from within. Putin claims Russia is fighting to preserve its sovereignty, but the very things that give a country its stability, fuel, trade, freedom of movement, a sense of safety, are eroding for ordinary people. And here's the contradiction that no propaganda can fully erase. Before the invasion, Moscow didn't have to worry about drones in the sky or sanctions choking its airlines. The war, launched in the name of security, has left Russia's biggest cities feeling less secure than ever. For decades, Moscow's ruling elite lived in a bubble. Sanctions were just words in Western newspapers. Wars were something that happened in Chechnya or Syria, and any hardship was pushed onto rural towns far away from the capital. But now, the bubble has burst. The war they thought would be quick and clean has crept into their own lives. Luxury cars sit idle in long gas lines. Private jets are grounded because replacement parts are impossible to find. Families of top officials whisper about sending their children abroad, not for education, but simply for safety. When drones circle Moscow at night, no one in Putin's inner circle sleeps soundly. For ordinary Russians, the shift is even starker. At first, many shrugged off the special military operation as a background noise. It was happening in Ukraine, not in their backyard. But every time the sky over Moscow closes, every time a supermarket shelf looks a little emptier, every time Telegram channels buzz with rumors of another attack, the illusion cracks a little more. People don't openly protest. The risks are too high. But frustration is leaking out in other ways. Jokes about the government, once whispered, are creeping back into kitchens and workplaces. Some families quietly discuss whether their sons will dodge the next wave of mobilization. Others look for escape routes, visas, distant relatives, even black market smugglers who promise a way out. Even within the political and business class, there's a subtle but growing unease. Oligarchs, once untouchable, now watch their fortunes shrink under sanctions. Some have died in mysterious accidents, fueling paranoia that loyalty is no longer enough to guarantee survival. Governors and mayors, tasked with keeping order, are suddenly on the front lines of panic management, explaining fuel shortages, calming angry citizens, pretending that airports shutting down is just routine safety. It's here, in these cracks, that the true pressure of the siege is visible. The Kremlin can censor headlines, but it cannot censor lived experience. When a drone explodes near your neighborhood, when your car sits dry at a gas station, when your flight disappears off the board, it doesn't matter what the news anchor says. You've seen the truth with your own eyes. And as more Russians experience this firsthand, the unspoken question grows louder. Is all of this worth it?